it's basically that misunderstanding which leads to many problems and errors in this national security strategy. And it's why the security strategy that President Trump is proposing would not improve U.S. security. It would worsen it. The basic idea of President Trump's national security strategy is we're so powerful, we can dictate terms. We should not be limited by quaint things like the United Nations or treaties or even normal relations with other countries. And within our own hemisphere, we're absolutely dominant, and we can tell the countries in our hemisphere what to do or not to do. And as we see in the case of Venezuela, we can threaten them, amass troops, perhaps overthrow a government with impunity. So the idea of the national security strategy is that the United States is the most powerful country in the world and should remain so. And by dint of being the most powerful country in the world, it remains strong by dictating the terms to other countries. Well, my critique is that this is all a bit of a delusion. We are not all powerful. In fact, what is clearly evident in the case of the Ukraine war is that the United States could not dictate, though it tried to for 30 years, the expansion of NATO to Russia's border. Russia said no, it came to blows. It's not going to happen. The United States cannot dictate terms in other parts of the world either. We can keep ourselves safe. We should deal with other countries in a mutually respectful way in order to enhance our security. And we should drop the delusions that we can overthrow governments at will or tell the Latin American countries, you can't deal with China, for example, another sub-theme of this strategy, because all of that is arrogance that's going to lead to a downfall, not the kind of prudence that leads to real security. Interestingly, what Trump is advocating here, at least vis-a-vis the rest of the countries in our own hemisphere, is what he calls a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
A corollary named after himself.
Of course. Well, the Trump corollary, we had another president, Theodore Roosevelt, whose name was attached to another so-called corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But frankly, neither Trump nor Teddy Roosevelt read very carefully what the Monroe Doctrine actually said. But what President Monroe said when he sent his seventh message to the Congress in 1823 is three stipulations. First, and this was in the aftermath of the wars of independence of the other countries of the Americas, that the newly independent countries of the Americas who had gained independence from the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, that Europe should not reclaim those colonies. In other words, the era of European colonization or empire building in the Americas was over. Second, that the Europeans should not introduce their military into the Americas. And third, which is almost entirely forgotten in our time, is the reciprocity that the United States, under the Monroe Doctrine, declares we will not interfere in Europe's wars and in Europe's security. So the Monroe Doctrine was actually stated in 1823 as a reciprocal doctrine. You stay out of our backyard and we'll stay out of yours when it comes to military and security issues. Don't threaten us. In other words, do not do unto others in the way that we dictate to them what they should do to us. We say, stay out of our hemisphere. Don't even come close. Don't dream of threatening us anywhere in the Americas. But if we want to have a military base in Ukraine, that's none of Russia's business. If we want to arm Taiwan, a part of China, that's none of China's business. In other words, we can say, oh, don't even come within thousands of miles. Don't even have a port servicing operation in Panama by a Hong Kong company. That's a threat to the United States. But we can have 750 or 800 military bases in around 80 countries of the world on anyone's borders without anyone telling us what to do. So the idea of the golden rule does not apply under the U.S. rubric. Now, what happened is, again, the U.S. has a particular history. It has been an imperial power from the start, but for the first hundreds of years, the empire building was on the North American continent. Right. It was on defeating Native American populations or attacking the Mexican government in Mexican territory to wrest a lot of the southwest of the United States, California for the United States, and so forth. That empire building of the United States lasted through the 19th century. It ended around 1890. And then immediately the United States said, okay, now we build an international empire. And it toppled the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1890s. And then in 1898, on very dubious grounds, went to war with a very weak and failing Spanish Empire and captured the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and basically held on to those territories. Cuba technically gained independence, but under something called the Platt Amendment, the United States asserted its right to intervene at will in Cuban affairs for decades afterwards. And that's why we still have a patch of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, where that naval base, that base and prison is held until this day. That came from the conquests of the United States in 1898. Soon after the Spanish-American War victory, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a real imperialist after all, declared his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, something very different. He said not only should Europe stay away, but he also said that the U.S. would be the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, quite explicitly, that we could go in to clean up bad behavior. One of the reasons, interestingly, why he said it is that Venezuela, of all countries, because we're at it again, in 1902 defaulted on its foreign debt. And the British and the French actually shelled the harbor of Caracas to get the Venezuelans to restart their debt payments. So Teddy Roosevelt said, we'll take care of that problem, not the Europeans. We'll be the policemen of our own hemisphere. But the Roosevelt corollary became a license for the Marines landing wherever they wanted, in Central America, in Cuba, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in repeated military interventions and regime change operations overthrowing governments. This led to a lot of instability. And when the sixth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt gained the White House, Franklin Roosevelt, and he came into the White House on March 4th, 1933, he declared a good neighbor policy. He repudiated his distant cousin's corollary, and he said, we will not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries in our hemisphere. And that was a principle that Roosevelt held to. And then it became part of a charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, which was adopted in 1948, which says explicitly in part of the charter, Article 19, no country should interfere in the internal affairs of other countries in the hemisphere. Well, along comes Donald Trump. His corollary is the Theodore Roosevelt corollary 10 times over.
But let me
It says not only are we the policemen, not only can we boss other countries around, but it's not only military issues where we're the policemen. We can tell other countries, you make contracts only with American companies, and you do not make contracts or trade or investments with countries we don't like, subtext China. So Trump is amping it up, telling other countries, we're going to run the whole show of our hemisphere. And this military buildup and killing people in boats off the coast of Venezuela is the application of what is called the Trump corollary. It's a lot of hubris. It's a lot of arrogance. It doesn't sit well with the rest of the world. And it's not going to work because it's a huge exaggeration of American power. That organizations like the World Trade Organization, that the UN, which is a US creation, that treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty were extremely important, not in a theoretical sense, but in a very practical sense of protecting America's national security. The idea is that you gain cooperation with other countries so that a group of countries decides we will not harm other countries. We'll hold ourselves to a shared international standard. We'll have monitoring, we'll have verification, but we will agree with other countries on proper behavior. It's not a quaint thought. It's a pretty basic thought of human behavior, that if you have a group and you want the group to behave, you establish principles. Well, Trump says, no, we're so powerful. Principles. Why do we care about principles? He sneers at transnational controls, meaning the United Nations. United Nations, that's just a petty encumbrance on us. We're so powerful, we should be able to do what we want without anyone telling us what we should do. If you're all powerful, yes, but if you're actually part of human society, you recognize that the United States is 4.1% of the world population. It's roughly 14% of the world economy. It's not 90%, it's not 50%, it's about 14%. You start to understand, and by the way, we're one of 9 nuclear-armed nations, you start to understand acting like we're all alone, that you don't need rules, that you don't need treaties, that you don't need international agreements, that you don't need the UN, and that all of that is just a petty encumbrance on the giant that we are. You can see how this could go quite wrong. China is a peer of the United States in innovation, and in many ways ahead of the United States. The World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, WIPO, issues a report each year on the most innovative regional clusters in the world. The U.S. thinks of Silicon Valley, which of course is a very innovative place. But when you look at that list, lo and behold, the United States is not in the top 3 of the clusters on that list. Number 1 is what's East China, what is called the Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. That's where the robots are going to come from. That's where a lot of the most high tech is coming from right now. That's where giant companies in China like Huawei and Tencent are located. That's rated number 1 in the world in innovation. One of the reasons is that while Silicon Valley has a lot of great ideas, they don't produce anything. Whereas in this cluster in China, they do everything. They do the ideas, they do the manufacturing, they do the international finance out of Hong Kong. They put all the pieces together, which Silicon Valley does not do. Number 2 on the list, by the way, is Tokyo, Yokohama, quarter. Number 3 on the list is Beijing. Number 4 is Silicon Valley. So we should have a little bit of understanding about the way the world is right now. But another point that I think is really important to emphasize is we don't have to be everything that's so grandiosely stated in the national security strategy to be safe. We're safe enough in the United States. We're very powerful. China cannot attack us. China cannot threaten the United States. The only way we are endangered is if we have a nuclear war with another nuclear superpower. So we ought to be careful. We ought to be prudent. We ought to behave properly. And then we're completely safe. China's not a threat to us, but it is a peer. It is a competitor. Okay. And by the way, we used to like open trade when we dominated everything. But now that China is able to compete with us, we say, oh, that's unfair. Come on. Toughen up a little bit, America. We can compete. We don't have to change all the rules because China's successful in competing. We should have been awake a decade ago, not only Tesla, but our big automotive companies. Where was General Motors and Ford and others when it was time to make electric vehicles? Okay, we said, nah, we're not interested. And then, okay, China now dominates the world electric vehicle industry. So that's our problem. We weren't there to be making these innovations, to be making this industrial generation after another, driving down the costs. Where were we when China was advancing, remarkably dropping the costs of solar power? Well, that was Trump. He was saying, drill, baby, drill, throughout the first term. Okay, and we're back again. So we gave up leadership to China in many of the clean technologies right now.
This is
in large-scale batteries, in electric vehicles, in solar power and wind power, in many areas. And then we say they're cheating. They're not cheating. We're not paying attention. We should have plans.